February 14, 1943, dawned cold and merciless over the Tunisian desert, where Private First Class Thomas McCary crouched behind a crumbling stone wall, watching German panzer tanks roll toward his position like mechanical predators. He clutched his M1 Garand rifle with white knuckles, but it was the single regulation entrenching tool strapped to his pack that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Not because he had it, but because it wasn't enough. Within hours, the Battle of Kasserine Pass would become America's first major engagement against Nazi Germany in North Africa, and it would end in catastrophic defeat with over 6,000 American casualties in just 4 days. The young soldiers of the Second Corps learned a brutal truth that day. You couldn't dig fast enough, deep enough, or smart enough with just one shovel when 88mm shells were turning the earth into a storm of shrapnel and death. McCary survived Kasserine Pass, but 63 men from his company did not. As he stumbled through the aftermath, passing hastily dug graves that were too shallow, because exhausted soldiers had only managed a few feet before their arms gave out, he noticed something that would change American infantry doctrine forever. A sergeant from the 1st Armored Division was carrying 2 entrenching tools, one standard issue strapped to his pack, and another German model he'd scavenged from a destroyed Wehrmacht position. When McCary asked why, the sergeant's answer was simple and profound. One to dig with, one to keep digging with when your arms are screaming and Jerry's artillery is walking toward your hole. The United States Army had entered World War II with the M1943 entrenching tool, a folding shovel that weighed just over 2 pounds and could theoretically excavate a foxhole in sandy soil within 2 hours. The reality on battlefields from North Africa to Normandy proved vastly different. According to military historian Rick Atkinson's Pulitzer Prize-winning work, An Army at Dawn, American infantrymen discovered that exhaustion, rocky terrain, and enemy fire made the 2-hour estimate laughably optimistic. Soldiers needed 4 to 6 hours to dig proper fighting positions, and by then, German mortar teams had often already found their range. The casualty rates among American forces who failed to dig adequate cover were staggering. Studies conducted by the War Department in 1944 revealed that soldiers in shallow or incomplete foxholes were 3 times more likely to become casualties than those in properly constructed defensive positions. But the problem wasn't just about speed or depth. It was about sustainability and tactical flexibility. When a soldier dug frantically for 30 minutes, his arms turned to rubber, his hands blistered and bled, and his effectiveness as a fighting man plummeted. Combat engineers attached to infantry units began experimenting with rotation systems, where men would alternate between digging and security watch, but this created dangerous gaps in defensive coverage. The solution emerged organically from the ranks themselves, spreading through units like wildfire. Carry a second shovel. Capture one from the enemy if possible. German entrenching tools were legendary for their quality, or requisition an extra from supply, or even purchase one from local sources in liberated territories. By late 1943, this unofficial practice had become so widespread that field commanders began formally recommending it in after-action reports, setting the stage for one of the war's most overlooked tactical innovations. Throughout March and April of 1943, Captain Bernard Kearns of the 5th Engineer Combat Battalion sat in a cramped tent outside Bija, Tunisia, compiling data that would revolutionize infantry survival tactics. Kearns, a civil engineer from Pittsburgh before the war, had been assigned by General Omar Bradley's staff to investigate why certain infantry units suffered significantly fewer casualties than others in identical combat situations. What he discovered wasn't about superior marksmanship, better officers, or even luck. It was about dirt, sweat, and the simple physics of excavation. His report, submitted in May of 1943 and eventually declassified in 1978, documented that units where soldiers carried multiple entrenching tools achieved full defensive positions 42% faster than units relying on single tools, and their casualty rates during artillery bombardments dropped by an average of 37%. Kearns interviewed hundreds of soldiers and discovered a consistent pattern. The primary shovel would be used for the initial aggressive excavation, breaking through hard-packed earth, severing roots, and displacing the first cubic feet of soil. when the soldier's dominant arm fatigued. Typically after 15 to 20 minutes of intense digging, he would switch to the second shovel, allowing the first arm to recover while maintaining momentum. This alternating pattern could be sustained for hours rather than minutes, and it meant the difference between a foxhole 18 inches deep and one 42 inches deep when German Nebelwerfer rockets began their terrifying screech across the sky. The mathematical advantage was undeniable. 2 shovels didn't just double efficiency, they multiplied it exponentially by preventing the physical breakdown that halted work entirely. The engineer companies had known this principle for years. Men who dug every day laying mines, constructing bunkers, creating tank traps, and building field fortifications routinely carried multiple digging implements because their survival and the success of their missions depended on sustained excavation capacity. According to the memoir, The Corps of Engineers, The War Against Germany, published by the Center of Military History, combat engineers working on the Siegfried Line fortifications in 1944 often carried 3 or 4 different digging tools, each optimized for specific soil conditions or tactical requirements. They had long abandoned the idea that one tool could serve all purposes, yet this knowledge had remained largely confined to specialist units while infantry soldiers, who did most of the dying, struggled with inadequate equipment. The gap between engineer wisdom and infantry practice represented a fundamental communication failure in military doctrine. The Army's field manuals emphasized weapon maintenance, squad tactics, and assault techniques, but devoted surprisingly little space to the unglamorous art of fortification. Private soldiers arrived in combat zones having spent perhaps 2 hours in basic training learning to dig foxholes, usually in the soft dirt of American training facilities that bore no resemblance to the rocky soil of Italy, the clay of France, or the volcanic ash of Pacific Islands. They were issued 1 shovel and told it was sufficient, even though the engineers who designed defensive positions for entire battalions knew this was demonstrably false. As Kearns documented in his report, the institutional knowledge existed within the Army, but it resided in the wrong places, creating a deadly disconnect that cost lives needlessly. What made Kearns' findings particularly compelling was his inclusion of testimony from German prisoners of war. Wehrmacht soldiers, veterans of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia consistently mentioned their surprise at how poorly dug American positions were during the early North African battles. A captured Obergefreiter from the 10th Panzer Division told Kearns through an interpreter that German infantry doctrine explicitly required soldiers to carry their standard entrenching tool plus whatever additional digging implement they could acquire: a pickaxe head, a mattock, or a captured enemy shovel. The German army had learned the importance of rapid fortification during the brutal combat on the Eastern Front, where Soviet artillery barrages made shallow positions death traps. This combat-tested knowledge had been integrated into Wehrmacht training, while American doctrine lagged dangerously behind, still operating on peacetime assumptions about what soldiers needed to survive industrial-scale warfare. On July 9, 1943, when the Allied invasion of Sicily commenced under the codename Operation Husky, Sergeant Frank Delano of the 45th Infantry Division splashed ashore at Skoglidi, carrying 47 pounds of combat equipment, including 2 entrenching tools strapped to his pack in an X pattern. His squad mates had initially mocked the configuration during the pre-invasion briefings aboard the USS Charles Carroll, calling him Double Dig Delano and joking that he planned to excavate his way to Rome. 3 days later, when German artillery from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division began systematically targeting American positions near the Acate River, those same soldiers were trading cigarettes, watches, and even ammunition to acquire second shovels from supply dumps, captured enemy stocks, or the personal gear of casualties. Delano's squad suffered 0 fatalities during the 38-day Sicily campaign, while neighboring squads with conventional equipment took 50 to 70% casualties, a statistical anomaly that battalion intelligence officers couldn't ignore. The practice spread through the American forces in Sicily like a survival meme, transmitted soldier to soldier through the most convincing argument possible: staying alive. Riflemen observed that machine gun teams and mortar crews who naturally carried crew-served weapons requiring multiple men, had long divided labor so that one member carried extra digging tools for the entire team. These weapons crews consistently established firing positions faster and survived longer than isolated riflemen still working alone with single shovels. Smart infantry sergeants began reorganizing their squads along similar principles, designating pairs of soldiers as digging buddies who would combine their tools and labor to create mutually supporting fighting positions twice as fast. This buddy system had the added benefit of preventing the psychological isolation that made soldiers in individual foxholes more vulnerable to panic during night attacks or artillery barrages. By September of 1943, when the Fifth Army landed at Salerno for the invasion of mainland Italy, the two-shovel practice had evolved from desperate improvisation into semi-official field procedure. Lieutenant Colonel John Forsyth, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 143rd Infantry Regiment, issued a typed memorandum on September 21st preserved in the National Archives explicitly ordering every rifleman in his battalion to acquire and maintain a secondary entrenching tool by whatever means necessary short of stealing from fellow American units. Forsyth's memo noted that his battalion had sustained 42% fewer casualties than adjacent units during the fierce German counterattacks at Salerno, and attributed this directly to superior fortification discipline. His innovation was to designate the second shovel not as optional equipment but as required combat gear, equivalent in importance to ammunition or water. The Italian campaign provided the ultimate testing ground for fortification tactics because the mountainous terrain and determined German resistance created a grinding, attritional warfare environment where every advantage mattered. American forces faced the Winter Line, the Gustav Line, and ultimately the Gothic Line sophisticated German defensive networks designed by some of the Wehrmacht's best engineers. The Germans held the high ground, possessed excellent observation, and could call artillery strikes with devastating accuracy. American infantry attacking uphill into these positions had no choice but to dig in wherever they gained ground, often under direct fire, and the speed with which they could create cover directly determined how many would survive until morning. Combat reports from the battles around Monte Cassino in early 1944 consistently mentioned the two-shovel practice, with company commanders noting it as a factor in their unit's survival rates. Yet despite mounting field evidence and growing adoption among combat units, the official Army supply system and training doctrine remained stubbornly unchanged. The Quartermaster Corps continued issuing one entrenching tool per soldier, and replacement troops arriving from the United States still received training based on pre-war manuals that emphasized speed of movement over defensive preparation. This created a dangerous knowledge gap where veteran units had evolved effective survival tactics, while fresh soldiers arrived woefully unprepared for the realities of combat. The disconnect would become tragically apparent during the Normandy invasion, where thousands of green troops would face the most sophisticated German defenses of the war with inadequate understanding of how to protect themselves once they got off the beaches. The two-shovel veterans of North Africa, Sicily, and Italy knew what was coming, and they tried desperately to share their hard-won knowledge with the men who would soon join them in France. In November of 1943, the War Department's Operations Research Group established a small team at the Pentagon with an unusual mandate: determine mathematically why soldiers lived or died in combat, then figure out how to shift the odds. Led by Dr. Howard Covington, a statistician from Columbia University, the team analyzed casualty reports, after-action summaries, and soldier interviews from every theater of war. Among their findings, published in a restricted circulation report in March of 1944 and referenced in military historian Paul Fussell's Wartime, Understanding and Behavior in the Second World War, was a stark revelation about the relationship between foxhole depth and survival probability. Soldiers in fighting positions less than 24 inches deep faced a casualty rate during artillery attacks of approximately 43%. At 36 inches deep, the rate dropped to 19%. At 48 inches or deeper with adequate overhead cover, it fell to just 7%. The implications were staggering. Proper excavation reduced your chances of death or maiming by more than sixfold. The data clarified what battlefield experience had been screaming. Digging deeper wasn't just good practice. It was the single most important action an infantryman could take to survive. Artillery and mortar fire caused approximately 60% of all combat casualties in the European theater, and the primary killing mechanism was fragmentation shell casings exploding into thousands of metal shards that traveled at supersonic speeds in expanding cones above ground level. A soldier standing upright had roughly 8 square feet of body surface exposed to these fragments. Lying prone reduced this to perhaps 3 square feet. But a soldier in a properly constructed foxhole, with only his head and weapon above ground level, exposed less than 1 square foot of vulnerable area. The geometry of survival was ruthless and precise, and every additional 6 inches of depth dramatically improved the protective angle. What made the two-shovel practice essential was time compression. Dr. Covington's team calculated that the average infantry unit, after capturing an objective, had approximately 90 minutes before German forces would organize a counterattack supported by pre-registered artillery fires. In that 90-minute window, soldiers had to consolidate their position, evacuate wounded, redistribute ammunition, establish fields of fire, and dig fighting positions. With a single entrenching tool, a soldier working non-stop could dig perhaps 24 to 30 inches deep in average soil, just barely reaching the threshold of minimal protection. With 2 shovels and the alternating arm technique, that same soldier could reach 36 to 42 inches, crossing into the zone where survival rates improved dramatically. The second shovel wasn't luxury equipment. It was the difference between inadequate cover and adequate cover during that critical 90-minute race against enemy artillery. The research team also investigated why some units naturally adopted the two-shovel practice while others didn't. They discovered it correlated strongly with leadership, quality at the squad and platoon level, and with the presence of combat veterans who could teach by example. Units led by sergeants who had survived heavy combat in North Africa or Italy almost universally adopted multiple tool practices, while units with green leadership stuck to regulation single-tool doctrine until catastrophic casualties forced adaptation. This suggested that official training and doctrine had failed to capture and transmit essential survival knowledge, leaving soldiers dependent on random exposure to veterans for lessons that should have been taught before they ever saw combat. The institutional failure wasn't just inefficient, it was lethal. Perhaps most damningly, the research revealed that the German, British, and Soviet armies had all recognized the importance of rapid fortification years earlier and had adapted their equipment and doctrine accordingly. British infantry carried the No. 2 Mark I entrenching tool but frequently supplemented it with pickaxes or mattocks at the squad level. Soviet doctrine emphasized collective digging with multiple soldiers using various tools to excavate fighting positions as crew projects rather than individual efforts. The Wehrmacht issued the exceptional folding shovel known as the Klapspaten, but German soldiers routinely acquired additional tools and were explicitly trained in team fortification techniques during their basic instruction. Only the United States Army clung to the assumption that one small folding shovel per soldier represented adequate preparation for industrial warfare, despite mounting evidence that this doctrine was killing American boys unnecessarily. The question wasn't whether change was needed. The data screamed that it was, but whether the institutional army could overcome its bureaucratic inertia fast enough to save lives in the campaigns to come. June 6, 1944 arrived gray and cold over the English Channel as Private Robert Maddox of the 29th Infantry Division climbed down cargo nets into the heaving landing craft, a salt that would carry him toward Omaha Beach. Strapped to his pack were 2 entrenching tools, his regulation, then 1943, and a captured German Klapspaten he'd traded 3 packs of Lucky Strike cigarettes for during training in England. His platoon sergeant, a veteran of the Sicily campaign named Mitchell Kowalski, had made it clear during their final briefing, "The beach is just the beginning. Once we're off that sand, we're fighting through hedgerow country where every field is a fort and every tree line hides a machine gun. You dig or you die, and you better dig fast." Maddox survived the beach landing despite the carnage that killed nearly half his company in the first hour, and by nightfall he was 3 miles inland, excavating a foxhole in the impossibly tough clay soil of Normandy while German mortar searched for American positions in the gathering darkness. The hedgerows of Normandy ancient earthen banks topped with thick vegetation that divided the French countryside into a maze of small fields, created a tactical nightmare that no amount of pre-invasion planning had fully anticipated. Each hedgerow was essentially a natural fortification, offering concealment and cover to defenders while channeling attackers into predetermined killing zones. American infantry advancing across these fields faced withering fire from German positions that were nearly invisible until soldiers were within grenade-throwing distance. The only way to survive was to reach the base of each hedgerow, dig in, suppress enemy fire, then assault across the next field to the next hedgerow in a grinding, exhausting process that consumed weeks and cost thousands of lives. Between attacks, soldiers lived in their holes, and those holes determined who saw home again. The geological composition of Norman soil presented challenges that few American soldiers had encountered during training. Unlike the sandy loam of stateside bases or even the varied terrain of North Africa and Italy, Normandy's soil was dense clay mixed with centuries of compacted organic matter, laced with rocks and tree roots. A foxhole that might take 90 minutes to dig in sandy soil required 3 to 4 hours in Normandy except. German artillery didn't wait 3 hours to bracket your position. Soldiers who carried only single entrenching tools found themselves in a desperate race they couldn't win, scraping and hacking at earth that seemed to resist every stroke while listening for the whistle of incoming shells. Men who carried 2 shovels or who paired up with buddies to combine tools and effort reached life-saving depth before the German fire missions found them. Corporal James Henshaw of the 4th Infantry Division, who landed at Utah Beach and fought through the hedgerows to St. Lay, later described the reality in an oral history interview preserved by the Library of Congress, Veterans History Project. You'd advance maybe 300 yards in a day, fighting for every hedgerow. When you finally took one, you had maybe 30 minutes before the German artillery observer called in the coordinates. If you weren't dug in by then, you were dead or wounded. We learned quick that 2 guys working together with 4 shovels between them 2 digging while 2 recovered could get a proper hole in 25 minutes. Guys working alone with 1 shovel might get halfway there before the shells arrived. I saw whole squads wiped out because they were still on the surface when the barrage hit. The scale of the Normandy fighting transformed the 2-shovel practice from a veteran's trick into a survival imperative that even the freshest replacement soldiers understood within days of arrival. The brutal mathematics of hedgerow warfare eliminated any ambiguity. Fast digging equaled survival, slow digging equaled casualty status. This Darwinian clarity drove rapid adaptation throughout the invasion force. Supply officers, recognizing the demand, began acquiring additional entrenching tools through unofficial channels. British stocks captured German equipment and emergency requisitions from the United States. By late June of 1944, the Quartermaster Corps was shipping extra entrenching tools to Normandy, not as replacement items, but as supplementary equipment, tacitly acknowledging that field practice had superseded official doctrine. The institutional army was finally catching up to what its infantry had known for more than a year. You couldn't give a soldier too many ways to get underground when the steel was flying. On August 3, 1944, Colonel William Summers of the Infantry School at Fort Benning, Georgia, signed Training Memorandum Number 12-44, a document that would finally codify what tens of thousands of combat infantrymen already knew from bitter experience. The memorandum, distributed to all infantry replacement training centers and combat units, officially recommended that soldiers carry supplementary entrenching tools when available and train in cooperative digging techniques. While stopping short of mandating 2 shovels as required equipment, the Quartermaster Corps simply couldn't produce enough to immediately equip the entire Army. The memo represented a watershed moment when institutional doctrine acknowledged that pre-war assumptions about individual equipment had been proven catastrophically inadequate. According to records in the Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, this memorandum marked the first time official training doctrine incorporated a tactical innovation that originated entirely from combat soldiers rather than from staff officers or academic military theorists. The path from battlefield practice to official doctrine had been tortuously slow, impeded by bureaucratic inertia, supply chain limitations, and the inherent conservatism of military institutions. Even as combat reports from North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy consistently documented the life-saving value of multiple digging tools, Army headquarters staff struggled to reconcile field reports with established regulations. The table of organization and equipment documents that governed what units were authorized to requisition and possess listed one entrenching tool per soldier, and changing these tables required approval from multiple headquarters sections, each protecting its bureaucratic territory. Procurement officers worried about manufacturing capacity and shipping space. Training command officers resisted changes to established training schedules. The result was a gap of more than 18 months between clear field evidence and official recognition, 18 months during which thousands of soldiers died in inadequately prepared fighting positions. What finally broke the institutional deadlock was the combination of mounting statistical evidence and pressure from combat commanders who were tired of losing men to preventable causes. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding the First Army in Normandy, became a vocal advocate for improving fortification practices after reviewing casualty analyses that showed dramatic variation in survival rates between units with different digging disciplines. Bradley's correspondence with General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, emphasized that American tactical advantages in mobility and firepower were being negated by inadequate defensive doctrine. In a letter dated July 24, 1944, Bradley wrote that improving fortification practices could reduce infantry casualties by 20 to 30% without requiring any new weapons, vehicles, or technology, just better tools, better training, and better doctrine. When a combat commander of Bradley's stature made such a clear argument, even the Pentagon bureaucracy had to respond. The training memorandum represented a compromise between what combat units needed and what the institutional army could deliver. It acknowledged the value of multiple entrenching tools without mandating them as required equipment, giving units authorization to acquire extra tools through various channels while not placing impossible demands on the supply system. It introduced formal instruction in cooperative digging techniques, teaching soldiers to work in pairs or teams rather than as isolated individuals. And it emphasized the critical importance of immediate fortification upon capturing terrain, making defensive preparation equal in priority to offensive action in the hierarchy of combat tasks. These changes might seem modest in hindsight, but they represented a fundamental shift in how the Army conceived of infantry combat, moving away from the offensive-focused doctrine of pre-war years toward a more realistic understanding of what soldiers needed to survive the industrial battlefield. Beyond the specific recommendations about tools and techniques, the memorandum's deeper significance lay in what it revealed about military adaptation during wartime. The United States Army of 1944 was a fundamentally different organization than the tiny, peacetime force that had existed in 1939, and one of the most important differences was its willingness, however grudging and delayed, to learn from combat experience and modify practices accordingly. The two-shovel practice emerged organically from soldiers facing death, spread laterally through informal networks, gained validation through systematic casualty analysis, and eventually reshaped official doctrine. This pattern of bottom-up innovation, empirical validation, and top-down adoption would characterize many of the tactical improvements that helped the American military become increasingly effective as the war progressed, learning lessons in blood that no peacetime training could have taught. While the two-shovel practice evolved primarily in the European theater, parallel developments unfolded across the Pacific, where United States Marines and Army infantry faced unique geological and tactical challenges that made rapid fortification equally critical. On November 20, 1943, when the 2nd Marine Division assaulted Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, they encountered coral reef and sand that created digging conditions opposite to Normandy's dense clay but equally difficult in different ways. Marine Corps Private Eugene Locklear, who survived the brutal 76-hour battle for Betio Island, later described in the official Marine Corps history how coral fragments would bend or break standard entrenching tool blades, and how Japanese mortar fire was so accurate that Marines had to excavate below the surface within minutes of securing any position. Those who carried supplementary tools, bayonets, captured Japanese implements, or extra entrenching tools could gouge out adequate cover in the coral sand mixture faster than those limited to single tools. The Pacific Island campaigns presented fortification challenges absent in Europe. Many islands consisted of volcanic rock covered by thin topsoil, or coral formations that resisted conventional digging techniques. Japanese defensive positions were typically sophisticated bunker systems built months or years in advance, while American forces had to create fighting positions hastily from whatever materials and tools they possessed. The Japanese military, drawing on decades of experience in China and Manchuria, had developed excellent fortification practices and equipped their soldiers with high-quality digging tools. American forces attacking these positions learned quickly that Japanese counterattacks would come swiftly, often at night, and that inadequate defensive preparation invited catastrophe. The Battle of Peleliu in September and October of 1944 exemplified this reality, with 1st Marine Division units suffering severe casualties, partly because the island's jagged limestone coral made foxhole excavation extraordinarily difficult. Army infantry units in the Pacific adopted multiple tool practices similar to those developed in Europe, but adapted them to jungle and island conditions. In New Guinea, the Philippines, and later Okinawa, soldiers carried entrenching tools, machetes for clearing vegetation, and often pickaxes or mattocks for breaking through root systems and hard-packed tropical soil. The jungle environment created different tactical requirements than European combat. Visibility was often limited to a few yards, artillery support was less dominant, and small unit actions were more common, but the fundamental need for rapid fortification remained constant. Japanese infiltration tactics, particularly the practice of night infiltration and close-quarters attacks, made it essential for American soldiers to create positions that provided all-around protection, not just frontal cover, which required more extensive excavation and therefore more digging capacity. The Marine Corps, with its emphasis on amphibious assault and its relatively small size that allowed faster doctrinal evolution, officially incorporated multiple tool practices into its training doctrine earlier than the Army. Marine Corps Training Manual No. 13-1, revised in February of 1944, explicitly addressed fortification techniques and recommended that Marine rifle squads carry supplementary digging tools distributed among squad members. The manual emphasized speed of preparation and team digging approaches, teaching Marines to work in pairs to create mutually supporting fighting positions. This doctrinal clarity gave Marines arriving at Pacific battlefields a significant advantage over their predecessors, who had learned these lessons the hard way at places like Guadalcanal and Tarawa. While Marine Corps forces still suffered horrific casualties in battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, their improved fortification practices helped reduce preventable deaths from inadequate defensive preparation. By 1945, as American forces prepared for the anticipated invasion of the Japanese home islands and operation, expected to dwarf even the Normandy landings in scale and bloodshed, the two-shovel practice and related fortification improvements had become thoroughly integrated into combat planning. Training for Operation Downfall, as the invasion was codenamed, emphasized defensive preparation as a core combat skill equivalent to marksmanship and small unit tactics. Quartermaster plans called for landing sufficient entrenching tools to provide multiple implements per squad, acknowledging that Japanese resistance would be fanatical and that American forces would need every possible advantage to reduce casualties. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945 made the invasion unnecessary, but the planning documents reveal how completely the lessons of fortification had been absorbed by the institutional military, transforming what began as a desperate improvisation in Tunisia into standard operating procedure for the entire American armed forces. When the Second World War ended in August of 1945, the United States military began the massive task of demobilization, sending millions of soldiers home and contracting to a peacetime force structure. But the tactical lessons learned in blood across two theaters of war remained embedded in doctrine, training, and institutional memory. The post-war infantry school at Fort Benning incorporated extensive fortification training into its curriculum, teaching new soldiers the techniques that veterans had developed under fire. The official Field Manual 3-21.75, The Rifle Squad, published in 1946, devoted an entire chapter to digging fighting positions and explicitly recommended carrying multiple entrenching tools when tactical situations permitted. What had been desperate improvisation in Tunisia had become accepted military wisdom, codified in the manuals that would train soldiers for the Korean War, Vietnam, and beyond. The two-shovel practice represented something larger than just a tactical technique. It exemplified how military organizations learn and adapt under the pressure of combat. Traditional military innovation had typically flowed from top to bottom, with staff colleges, research institutions, and senior officers developing doctrine that subordinates would implement. But the two-shovel practice emerged from the bottom up, invented by soldiers who faced immediate mortal threats and who couldn't wait for official doctrine to save their lives. The practice spread laterally through informal networks of veterans teaching replacements, through word of mouth, through observation of which soldiers survived and which didn't. Only after field adoption was widespread did the institutional army recognize, validate, and officially adopt the practice. This pattern of innovation battlefield necessity creating solutions, survivors spreading knowledge, institutions eventually catching up, would characterize many of the most important tactical developments of modern warfare. The statistical impact of improved fortification practices, including the two-shovel technique, can be seen in casualty data from throughout the war. According to the United States Army's official, the Corps of Engineers, the war against Germany, casualty rates from artillery and mortar fire, the primary threats that fortification protected against, declined progressively from 1943 through 1945, even as the intensity of combat increased. While multiple factors contributed to this improvement, including better medical care and enhanced artillery counter-battery capabilities, post-war analysis concluded that improved defensive practices were responsible for a significant portion of the casualty reduction. Thousands of American soldiers who would have died or been maimed in shallow fighting positions survived because they could dig deeper, faster, thanks to the simple expedient of carrying an extra shovel.